Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special council meeting. We have one item on the agenda, and then, of course, plus the in-camera authorization later on. So the process this afternoon, or the sequence of things, Karina Tasker, our internal auditor, will make a few brief comments, and as the agenda shows, Duncan Webb, the consultant, will make a presentation, and then we will have three responses from Marcus Shantz, Linda Fabi, and Sylvie Di Donato. And then we have one other citizen delegation who is registered this afternoon. We will listen to her, and that delegation will have 5 minutes to make her presentation. So I'd like to flow through all of the first four presentations without any questions, because I think the process will likely end up with some questions being answered with some of the responses. If there is an absolute burning issue that you totally don't understand something as we're going through, then we'll ask that question at the end of those four. But I would really encourage you to hold all of those questions, make notes of them until after all four have spoken. And then we'll go to the citizen delegation, and then we'll get into further open questions and dialogue. So, having said that, Karina.
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor Zaire and members of council. As you know, we're gathered here today to hear the results of the operational and strategic review of Centre in the Square and the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, as well as to hear the management responses to those recommendations. But first, on behalf of the City and the Centre in the Square and KWS, I would sincerely like to thank Mr. Duncan Webb of Webb Management Services, Inc., for the in-depth research and analysis that he and his team have done on this assignment. They were contracted to provide an unbiased analysis of the current state of affairs and then provide recommendations for a mutually sustainable model that meets the financial goals and organizational mandate of each organization. So now I will just turn it over to Mr. Webb to give you his presentation of the findings and recommendations that are in his report.
Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you, Karina. Mr. Mayor, members of council, thank you for having me here to present the results of our work. This is my fifth visit to Kitchener. In conjunction with this study, I very much enjoyed working in your community. I'm very grateful for all the help that we had in doing this work, the 60-plus people who were interviewed, city staff, Karina, and others for helping us, and most importantly, representatives of the organizations, both the Symphony and City in the Square, for how forthcoming they were with their staff and information in order to help us do this analysis. I'm going to march through 20 slides, which is a summary of the full study, which I believe you have. I'll apologize in advance for the small type, but the full study that you have is a lot more graphically interesting than this. This is the most efficient way for me to march through a lot of work in a relatively quick period of time. All right, so next. Oh, no, I do that, right? All right, so I'm a management consultant to people who build and operate cultural facilities. We roam around North America working for cities, schools, developers.
Just a moment. It's not showing up on all of the screens. Is it turned on? They're on over here. Are all there? And mine is. We live in a technology city, so. Are you there? Coming. There is a hard copy of the slides in your presentation, so perhaps we can go with that to start, and hopefully it will come back up. Somebody can be working on that. I still don't see them. Dan will take care of that. Okay, sorry for the interruption.
No problem.
Go ahead.
So, as I said, this is what we do. We roam around mostly North America working for government and others, helping people think about building, fixing, and sustaining mostly performing arts facilities. We started in 1997. In fact, I started in Toronto in 1988 when I was hired by the Toronto Symphony to advise them on what to do with Massey Hall. We're based in New York now. We have a fair amount of work back in Canada, recently the town of Oakville, Fredericton Playhouse, and working with the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. So our brief here, as Karina outlined, was to review the operations of both Centre in the Square and the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, and then to look at their operating relationship with each other and with the city. Then we were asked to advise the city and those groups on how to strengthen their operations and their relationships. So to do this, we did an extensive course of interviews. We did lots of facility touring. We gathered mountains of data from the two organizations. And then a lot of information we collected from symphonies and buildings similar to these two, and also markets across Canada that were comparable to the Kitchener-Waterloo region. And then, as well as that, we brought with us some of our sort of perspective on the larger forces and trends at play in the performing arts sector today. So let me first address a few of those forces and trends. In Canada, attendance at cultural programs is steady these days. Government support for the arts has been increasing, unlike the United States, but private sector support has been stagnant. The greatest single challenge facing the performing arts sector is something we refer to as Baumol's cost disease, named for two New York University professors who wrote this book in 1965 called The Economic Dilemma of the Performing Arts. Essentially, it boils down to the idea that as costs are always increasing, if you don't have any productivity gains associated with what you do, you fall behind. The commercial sector, businesses make sense in the commercial sector because their productivity gains at least match cost increases. The challenge in our world is that we don't really have productivity gains. It takes the same time and energy to rehearse and perform a Brahms symphony today as it did in 1868. So because of that, we're always falling behind. And the way that we compensate is essentially you have to be able to fundraise a little bit more money every year just to keep up. Consumer behavior is also changing around participation in the arts. Audiences are less willing to make advance commitments, the old subscription model. They want more stimulation, a more social experience, more control of how they interact and experience the performance, more convenience, and at the same time they're more risk averse. So facilities around the world in North America are responding to these challenges. The big change is they're becoming 24/7 buildings, always open, always active, inclusive, integrated into the life of their communities. The social aspect of coming to a performance is stressed. Secondary spaces become more important for programming. Educational programs become more important as a way to bring more of the community into the building. And there's a new emphasis on opportunities for active participation in the arts, not just the sort of the passive role of coming and sitting in an audience. Symphonies also have tremendous challenges all over the world, the financial pressures that are on them because of their ever-increasing costs and those productivity problems. So the response in the sector is to work to enhance performance revenues, try and reduce the rate of growth in expenses, raise more money, and this is the key, focus a stronger value proposition to the community. So here's what we, as a symphony orchestra, offer to you, the community that we serve. So here I'm boiling about sort of 30 slides down into one quick summary of our look at the symphony. So this is a mature and busy organization, excellent reputation through touring and recording. The orchestra itself is both experienced and cohesive. They have 37 different programs this last year, 27 of which were held at Centre in the Square. There are classical and the usual sort of pops programs, but also a number of more innovative educational programs. Ticket sales have been increasing just ever so slightly over time. Performances tend to be oriented towards Fridays and Saturdays. Audiences are concentrated in Kitchener. There's a nifty map in the long report that you'll see, stretching out to about 30 kilometers away. The staff is small, but long-serving, committed, and hardworking. Limited resources mean that there are some gaps in their current staff in areas like marketing, fundraising, and education. The organization has been under significant financial pressure for years. This is not a new situation. They are tightly managed. Expenses do continue to grow for the reasons that I've talked about. Their challenge has been driving revenues. And they're doing quite well in the public sector area and government support in particular, distributed between various municipalities, regional government, the province, and the federal government. The Symphony is working hard to develop new partnerships with the corporate and educational sectors. The problem is that they lack the resources to really develop those programs to their full potential. Relative to similar Canadian cities, this CMA, the metropolitan area, has the size and characteristics that should be able to support an organization like this. So we think the market is strong enough for this organization. And then we compared the Symphony to a series of other symphonies across Canada, and there are a lot of similarities, many more than there are differences. They are a little bit busier than others, but they have the same orientation to weekend performances and a discounted cost of access to their main concert hall. So all of that analysis led us to the following conclusions on the Symphony. They're appropriately focused on external issues, this idea of the value proposition, including partnerships with education, technology, science, and the entrepreneurial sector in the Kitchener. But there are limited resources that allow them to develop and execute those programs. Beaumont's cost disease is clearly at work here, as with other performing arts groups. It explains the increasingly difficult challenges of sustaining the organization and suggests that more challenges lie ahead.
Flip the next screen, next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Right. In the near term, we're suggesting that their focus should be on building revenue to drive sustainability and the development of additional skills and resources. There may be some opportunities to drive earned revenue, issues like strategic planning, schedule optimization, sort of moving around a little bit during the week, Thursdays, more on Thursdays, less on Sundays. Fundraising will remain very important, though they may be nearing market saturation. There is still some additional potential to raise more money in and around Kitchener to sustain the organization. Current conflict and unresolved scheduling issues with Centre in the Square are a major barrier for the organization to attracting additional contributed income and to stabilizing long-term operations. So we're suggesting that their challenge is to find another $400,000 or so in annual fundraising just to stabilize them as they are today, and then to see if they can add another $200,000 to $300,000 to pursue, really to develop these non-traditional, non-performance-based partnerships. So our recommendation our recommendations are as follows. The first thing is to resolve conflict and to rebuild a strong working relationship with Centre in the Square. The next step is to build a new 5-year plan for financial stability, and that plan needs to focus on new skills, resources, really pushing these partnerships, deliver more value to the region, a stronger board, and really going after some of the newer private sector wealth that exists in the area. We do recognize that there's a long road ahead in rebuilding relations with Centre in the Square. It has to start with a facilitated discussion to address and work through past conflicts, sources of tension. There has to be agreement on management of the calendar, likely concessions from the Symphony and also from the building, but also sort of a broader search for more options and solutions. And we do think that eventually the Symphony should have a closer physical relationship with Centre in the Square to be physically present in the building. Then they can look for new economies and efficiencies of being together, including the delivery of educational programs, the integration of back office operations, cooperative marketing efforts, including ticketing, customer relationship management, analytics, and so on. So in the longer term, we are suggesting that ultimately the Symphony will have to consider the sort of integration and ultimately the consolidation of their operations in several possible directions. One is going towards sort of a more of a regional symphony, partnering with groups like Hamilton and London, moving back towards the academic sector, which here means a stronger partnership and relationship with Wilfrid Laurier, or third, to move in the direction of a reintegration back into Center in the Square. The first of those, the regional symphony idea, sort of sounds great. There are no good models or precedents of orchestras in North America that are able to go all the way with that, and we recognize it's a very tough challenge. Wilfrid Laurier is attractive, but also very difficult to achieve given the nature of an academic institution. And we really do like the idea of pushing the reintegration with Center in the Square. I'm sorry, I'm leaving you behind by one. So that's our preferred option, and ultimately might lead to a merger of those two organizations. There are opportunities for collaborative programs and services along the way, but the thing is that Center in the Square starts with a fabulous, one of the best acoustic halls in North America for classical music, and that is a critically important issue. We recognize that mergers and consolidations in the nonprofit art sector are very difficult. There are a few good ones and more of them that are now in process, but it will be complicated and difficult to achieve. But the benefits of that combined organization far outweigh the risks of going down this road. The other thing that's important is that there are these intermediate steps in this process, and they're starting with shared services, joint programming, shared premises, shared risk, ultimately shared board, and the legal combination. But the good thing is that each of those intermediate steps is a test, and it moves them forward, but each one of them also provides significant benefits to both of those partners as they move forward together. So the final slide on the symphony, this is a quick attempt on my part to show what could happen to their operating budget as and if they move forward with the recommendations that we've made. And they have their own fiscal 2013 actual results here, their 2014 budget. So I've just extended that out to 2016, showing that I think that they're able, without very aggressive projections on my part, to bring that result of operations down closer to a positive number in these next several years. So now let's move to Center in the Square. And again, my apologies, there's a lot of analysis I've squeezed into one slide. This is a building that opened in 1980. The key is this acoustically excellent 2,047-seat multipurpose hall. But very importantly, this additional flexible space, it's the home for the art gallery and good additional support spaces, which used to include the offices of the symphony. Though it's owned by the city, the facility is operated by a not-for-profit corporation with 10 directors, which include one symphony representative, the mayor, and 2 members of council. Though that governance structure has historically worked quite well, there seem to be some problems with it today. And one is that council has been put in the position of being asked to opine on operating issues related to Center in the Square. And we think this is something that shouldn't sort of ultimately get to council. The second issue is that there are independent members of the Center in the Square board who have become sort of a bit detached and uncertain as to their independence to serve the operating organization as opposed to the city. The main hall of Center in the Square is busy, good combination of rental activity and presenting, meaning the hall books artists and takes financial risk. It covers a wide variety of genres. Comedy, music, and dance are on the rise. Capacity sold and average ticket prices have been decreasing, really as a result of a shift in programming strategy over the past couple of years and trying to sort of sort that out. Weekend and high season shows are selling more seats, and hence there's this tension around weekends, the Fridays and Saturday nights. Although we do think in looking at these numbers that there is some opportunity for more programming, types of programming other nights of the week. So the emphasis doesn't just have to be about Fridays and Saturday nights. Audiences do tend to live nearby. We've got another one of those maps in the full report. You'll see the directions that they're coming from. The The biggest strength of the building is that it is in a very strong competitive position regionally, given the size of the large hall and that acoustical environment it offers for classical music and other types of programs. The organization itself is large, more than 170 total staff members, and management itself still in a transition with Sandra's arrival and sort of trying to work through reorganization of that large organization. Financial performance has been variable from year to year. In fiscal 13, as you're aware, there was a close to $1 million loss due to a combination of programming losses, things that were sort of left over from previous management, a couple of larger shows that did not perform well, some loss that was sort of budgeted in, and then having to hold on to summer staff that last year. Relative to similar venues in Canada, we like the mix of presenting and rental activity. It's a pretty good way that they're bringing the building to life. And with other buildings, they have this common challenge of providing key tenants with a reduced cost of access. So the situation that you're in here with this building of a group or a couple of groups having a sort of deeply discounted access is not uncommon. Relative to other markets in the country, we think the CMA, the Statistical Metropolitan Area, has the size and the characteristics to support an active programs at the building. So again, we think the market is strong enough to support this building where it is. On Centre in the Square, we reached a number of important conclusions. It's a vital community asset that can play a larger role in advancing the cultural sector. Its particular strengths are that capacity and the acoustical qualities of the main hall. At the same time, it's fallen behind a little bit in terms of capital maintenance, and the operating organization is no longer seen as a leader and supporter in the cultural sector. The Centre in the Square leadership recognizes this challenge, and since we started our work, has been reporting progress in that regard. The building is busy, but financial performance has been a little bit tougher in recent years with additional capital expenditures and flat revenues. So we do see the potential to improve financial performance with a combination of dynamic pricing, scheduling optimization, new partnerships, ancillary income opportunities, and the search for operating economies. So the pressures that this building are under are common to pressure that these buildings are under all over North America. Nonprofit renters have limited capacity to pay rent. The nature of the organization makes them, and thus the building, vulnerable to Beaumont's cost disease. Local government budgets are tight. The argument for direct support of the arts is hard to make, and competition in the private sector for philanthropic support is intensifying. The current conflict and the standstill with the city and the symphony is really reflective of the financial pressures that the building is under. Conflict over rent, booking priority, and calendar management are really common to all of these buildings. But most buildings are able to keep moving forward through reference to mission, leadership, constant communications, and a strong working relationship with key constituents. The problem here is that the matter has reached you all, that elected officials are being asked to judge the relative merits of Fridays and Saturday nights. The Symphony is a dominant user of the building, and its low cost of access relative to other Centre in the Square users, not relative to other symphonies in large buildings like this, does impact Centre in the Square's overall financial performance. So we've made a number of recommendations for Centre in the Square. The first thing, as we've said with the Symphony, is for these two groups to come back together for a facilitated discussion on how to resolve differences and lingering tensions between the two organizations. The priority must be to come to terms on dates, rents, cost recoveries, and other access issues for the coming seasons. Compromises will be required on both sides. Then the discussion can turn to other important longer-term issues and new arrangements that improve communications and revive the spirit of cooperation between the two groups. The city, with the guidance of Centre in the Square leadership, should then work on developing a new mission statement for Centre in the Square. You own this building. It's up for you to decide what you want it to do for your community and your taxpayers. This should be informed by a review of options and choices made looking at other facilities and how spaces deliver value to their communities. The city can then review and consider various governance options and move towards a preferred choice. The single most important thing about these buildings is how they come to life. We applaud the work that Sandra and her staff have done pursuing more innovative programming, but we think that there are other choices and options that are also worthy of consideration, including the potential to develop the meeting and event business, expanding further into the world of arts education, becoming a more active landlord, becoming a service provider, a facility manager, and a leader, again, for the regional cultural sector. So the city should then initiate a planning process to look at the need for physical improvements at Centre in the Square, to catch up on existing capital maintenance, but then more importantly to consider how the building should be renovated and upgraded to be attractive for the next 30 years. This also includes consideration of how the symphony can be brought back to the building towards a more aggressive integration of operations with that group. So you've asked us to provide some more specific ideas around this question of governance. So the first level of changes we're calling tweaks. That is to say, what are the small things you can do with the governance model that make it work a little bit better? This means things like clarification of roles and responsibilities, making sure things are happening today the way they used to happen. There might be some small changes around the number of council representatives, voting rights, additional independently appointed board members, or some changes or additional protocols around conflict resolution and mediation. Then you could consider some slightly larger changes. One might be the creation of a separate foundation to represent the interests of the private sector in the operation of the building, and that sort of removes the building a little bit more from the city. The other option is an establishment of an authority, sort of a quasi-government that represents the interests of the city in the operation. So there are just slight sort of changes. Around those, there are sort of pros and cons to them, moving to either sort of the authority or the foundation models. We like those options because they might get the private sector more highly motivated to fundraise on behalf of the center, as long as they're given a sufficient responsibility. And elected officials are more likely to get sort of stuck dealing with operating issues, and their appointees can be selective for their expertise in those areas. The con, the sort of the negative part of that, is that these smaller changes might only be lipstick on a pig if private sector still sees this as a city sort of run building. And it's harder to build this sort of a regional mission and focus if the building's still controlled by a city authority. There are good precedents, including Centennial Hall in Winnipeg and a client of ours in Center for the Performing Arts in Portland, Oregon. So here's three more dramatic options for Centre in the Square. One is to have the building operated directly by local government, in this case by the city. So this would give the city more direct control, and there are lots of examples in Canada of municipally or sort of regional government operated facilities like the Sanderson Centre in Brantford. It's a good idea because management orientation is very much towards the public and would support individual access and access for local arts groups. Cities are good at running buildings and have access to the skills and resources that might help the support of the operation of the building. And it provides essentially a safety net. It provides more secure funding for the building operations. There are also significant negatives to this option. One, it will require more money on the part of the city. There is the risk of more political interference in the operation of the facility. The cost might be increased because the building is subject to government budgeting and procurement methods that might drive some costs up. Public scrutiny and objectives to certain programming choices might also sort of impact the ability to pursue a strong programming mission. And the hardest thing is it's more difficult to convince the public to donate money to a government-run facility, as they tend to believe that their tax dollars represent their contribution to operations. The next option is to go in the other direction. Let's have a purely independent nonprofit operator of the building. So it's bound to the building as some kind of a lease agreement or a contract, allows the owner, the city, still to have some influence, through various conditions. So the EPCOR Center in Calgary is a good example of this model. The pros, it's operated by a mission-driven organization that allows lots of different people to be involved. Nonprofits are transparent. There tends to be good public accountability for their operations. There's an organizational orientation towards private sector fundraising, which will reduce reliance on government. And a nonprofit can represent the region and its interests, not just the municipality. But there are also significant negatives to this option. Nonprofit organizations have to fundraise themselves to support operating expenses, and there are rarely any guarantees of funding. They annually are competing for funding, and they end up competing for funding with the groups that they are intended to serve in the building. Fluctuations in the economy, commitments of philanthropists, there's always some risk around long-term sustainability, and this is the case not just with buildings, but with all organizations. And finally, nonprofits are only as good as the boards that run them, and you must believe that there is a deep pool of community leadership able and willing to contribute their time and energy and financial resources to the organization. The third of these options is to look at a third-party contractor, and here this is a sort of a newer option that's become more popular in the last 20 years in North America, to hire by contract a private nonprofit, actually more often a commercial organization to operate the facility. So they're bound by a contract which tends to be sort of 3 to 5 years with some options to extend. A good example in the region is Global Spectrum operating Hamilton Place for the city of Hamilton. So there are pros with this option. If it works well, the city and the building operator share the sort of the net proceeds of that operation. These commercial operators are good at programming, they're good at running buildings and promoting events. It can continue to be available to outside groups, including nonprofits. And bringing in one of these larger corporations, they bring with them certain efficiencies because they're operating multiple buildings. They tend to be very good negotiators with touring programs and are pretty good at sort of making money on presenting. But again, there are significant cons to this. There's always lots of risk and variability, and depending on the kind of contract you have, your level of risk and cost can vary over time. Third-party operators tend to be more attracted to markets where there are larger or multiple venues to operate. So it would be hard to get them here just for one space. Facility management contracts generally include management fees, ticketing fees, and a profit share in addition to facility service fees. So there is significant cost to it. And it tends to add tension to the relationship between the building and the nonprofit users. They're even more nervous about a commercial operator as opposed to a nonprofit or government-related operator. Not to say that it can't work, but there's always a lot of tension around those relationships. So our recommendation is essentially do as little as you need to do in order to make the current structure work again. So we don't think that there's any fundamental flaw in the way that you've chosen to operate the building, but if you need to make tweaks and small changes to make it work the way it was working, we would encourage you to do that. Part of that reason is that those other options are the negatives in our mind outweigh the positives. The third-party commercial operator will probably bring financial terms that don't necessarily reduce the city's commitment to the building. You'd have this conflict with the nonprofit groups. The city operation will put more strain on the private sector fundraising operations and cost you more money. And we've heard of your sort of relationships with independent nonprofits operating city assets your experience has been sort of mixed at best. So whatever direction you go, the thing that is most important is that you go through this exercise working with Center in the Square to rewrite the mission for that organization, which is the mission that you set for the building as you are the owners of the building. Now, several more recommendations. So once the question of mission and governance has been addressed, we encourage Center in the Square to develop a programming plan that recognizes all the various options and opportunities that exist. Things like more at-risk presenting, further developing education programs, going further into the meeting and event business, and perhaps acting as a service provider for the sector, perhaps in partnership with the Creative Enterprises Institute. Then it will be very important to address the physical state of the building, and here we are recommending that the city prepare and issue an RFP to a physical planning team, some combination of architect, theater consultant, and acoustician, to come in and do a 3 to 4 month exercise of saying not just what it takes to bring the building back up to where it needs to be today, but what do you need to do to make it work, to make it compelling for audiences and users for the next 30 years. And finally, I've developed another pro forma operating budget for Center in the Square that takes them from their actual results in fiscal 13 out to fiscal 16, I think in a fairly conservative way, sort of increases in earned revenue, a little bit more contributed income, no expense reductions per se, but careful management of expenses, we think is possible to move towards a balanced budget within the next several years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. It is a lot of material to work our way through, but I think it is a good summary of the study so far. I'll now go to Mark Ashant, who is chair of the Center in the Square board. Response?
Thank you for your time. Late last year, I volunteered to extend my term on the center board for 1 year in order to serve as interim chair, and to put it mildly, this was a very interesting year to serve in that capacity. The planning for this review began in January, and the process was a marathon for everybody involved. And speaking personally, it was a pleasure to work closely with city staff, with Mr. Webb and with Linda and Catherine from the Symphony Board. And I'd like to start by speaking directly to one of the observations in the review, which is that there have been tensions between the KW Symphony and the Center in the Square. I believe that these tensions exist because both organizations believe that they're competing for scarce resources. In other words, the tensions are not personal. They arise out of our circumstances, and they're driven by the tough business facts that both organizations confront. The Center's board and our staff fully understand how important the symphony is to our community. We know how lucky we are to have an orchestra of this caliber and quality. And more than that, we remember that if it weren't for the symphony, the Center in the Square would not have been built over 30 years ago. It was symphony people who had the vision to build a first-rate hall in our town. And the result is that Kitchener has a performing arts venue that's still considered to be one of the best in the country. I'm not sure that we would have the nerve to build it from scratch today. I'm told that it would cost between 70 and 100 million to build a hall like this in today's dollars. And I think that owning and maintaining a 2,000-seat venue is quite ambitious for a city the size of Kitchener. I agree that our region's population supports a hall of this size, but of course Kitchener is only one part of the whole region. But the Center's more than a building. The original vision in 1981 was that the Center would be an arts organization in its own right. It's not just a physical asset. We have a highly skilled crew and management team, and they're proud that the Center represents a wide range of content to different audiences, because it's a public building that belongs to the whole community. So we respect the history, but we need to talk about the future, and what worked 10 or 20 years ago does not necessarily work today, and certainly won't in the future. And all of us need to make changes. And that's why the Center in the Square supports the 4 staff recommendations emerging from this report. They get us talking about the future, they move us towards a plan, and they recognize that changes need to be made by all parties. We thank Duncan Webb and his team for the work they put into the report. We think that the work is valuable, particularly in providing a context for what's happening in performance arts organizations across North America. And we note that many communities are struggling with the same issues we're facing here. We agree that capital improvements and maintenance are a pressing issue. And in order to begin addressing those issues, the Center made over $1.8 million in capital investments over the past couple of years. This is a good start, but our technical audits have identified an additional $2 million of projects that will need to be addressed in the future. It's worth remembering that the center is also responsible for maintaining over 20,000 square feet of space occupied by the KW Art Gallery. And providing appropriate space for an art gallery is expensive and adds to our capital and operating challenges. When I joined this board in 2008, the center's past management was focused on launching a major capital fundraising campaign, which would have addressed repair and maintenance issues as well. Unfortunately, despite 5 or so years of development work, the center was not able to launch a major fundraising effort. Our hope is that the center can position itself for a successful campaign in the future, and as Mr. Webbs alluded to, some of the work that we do in the next stage of this process can help us move in that direction. But in the short term, we remain in a difficult position. Mr. Webbs also put forward a number of observations, suggestions, and operating models that may be useful in future discussions. We don't necessarily endorse every one of those suggestions, but we will take them seriously, and we're grateful for them, and we'll consider them in the next phase of the process. The note of caution that I want to highlight is related to the suggestions for new revenue streams at Center in the Square. We're not opposed to exploring any of those areas, but as we highlighted in our written response, I don't think there can be automatic results from pursuing any of them. I don't believe that in the short term they impact on the center's operating challenges. The truth is that starting up new lines of business may require us to make more investments. For example, if we wanted to get into the meetings and events business, SITs may require more furniture, equipment, and capital upgrades. Mr. Webb's report correctly notes that Center in the Square operates a lean management team relative to other halls. And that means that expanding into administrative services or educational outreach may also require further investments in staff time. And in the case of at-risk presenting, we know that it's just as possible to lose money as it is to make it, and that's why it's called at-risk presenting. It means that the center hires the performers and accepts the risk of promoting the show and selling the tickets. We have taken some programming risks in the last 2 years in order to build new audiences for center shows. Once again, this can result in short-term losses rather than gains. And I repeat that we're not negative about any of these possibilities. We'll consider all of them, and there's some good ideas there. But I think they may require us to spend more money and not less, at least in the short term. That's how it is when you start up a new business. The report makes it clear that venues like the center have limited options for increasing earned revenue. And more than 2 years ago, our management determined that the safest way to generate new earned revenue was to increase our rental business to commercial artists. We never thought that that was a complete solution, but it was something that we saw as an important piece of the puzzle. Generally speaking, renting is the opposite of at-risk presenting. Renting means that the artist pays us to rent the hall, and the artist accepts the risk of selling tickets and promoting the show. It means that we get paid whether or not the show does well. We also knew that in order to increase our rental business, we needed to provide more Fridays and Saturdays. And that's because rental clients prefer weekend dates. That's what led us to ask the Symphony to release some of their weekends to the center. And my intention is not to go over old ground or to posture, but simply to explain clearly so that it's well understood why calendar management was considered to be important to the center's operating plan. Without greater access to the calendar, it's difficult for us to promise short-term gains in earned revenue. Calendar management remains an important issue for us to resolve. So I think that all stakeholders are going to have to remain somewhat patient while the center, KWS, and city staff move into the next phase of this process. And as we take time to make decisions, we're going to need more patience. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Linda Fabi. Linda is a member of the board of the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony and representing Catherine Kopp, I take it, who is chair.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mayor Zare, City Councillors, and staff who are present this afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here. This is my 6th year serving on the board of the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony. I chair a couple of committees for the Symphony and occasionally, based on my background, offer some educational advice from time to time. And I'm a member of executive committee, so I do represent the KW Symphony Board and Catherine Kopp, who is unable to be here today. I would like to begin my comments by first of all thanking the City of Kitchener for its support and encouragement in engaging in this process. I want to sincerely thank the Centre of the Square Board and Chair Marcus for the greatly collaborative approach that has enabled us to share information and work collegially together on a problem that we all are encountering. And finally, to thank Web Management for the thoroughness of the report that you've presented and the patience and the interpretation you provided for us today. That's been great. This has been an invigorating process, but it has opened up important lines of communication and information sharing between our two organizations and the city. I appreciate the opportunity to address you this afternoon, and we were quite eager to and ready to move forward. I want to state up front to those present this afternoon that the the KW board would clearly support Chair Shantz's comments about tension existing. It is not personal. It's very directed around cost management. And in fact, we are working towards solutions and continuing to look for ways in a way to resolve the date's issues. And in fact, the KW Symphony season is already planned for this coming year and the season beyond that. But we do need to resolve those issues. The report highlights valuable information about the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony operations, and among other things, it identifies some of the strengths that the KW Symphony is. Very active symphony, it's a professional orchestra, does tremendous work for its size, and does have an excellent reputation beyond. These and other benchmarks allow us to provide a good comparison of the KW Symphony with other symphonies across the country to look for areas where we can find some suggestions that we can make some future changes for the better. After reviewing the report that was provided by Mr. Webb, the Symphony Board appreciates the strengths that were identified. That's always good to hear, as were strengths identified for the Centre and the Square. However, a number of ideas were presented, and we were pleased and ready to have discussion about a variety of ideas. I'd like to assure those present today that the main focus for the KW Symphony is to continue to build its partnership with the Centre and the Square. Clearly one of the best performance halls in North America, and that certainly has been alluded to this afternoon. And as we're aware and appreciate the comments that KW Symphony patrons over 30 years ago were instrumental in the creation of the Centre and the Square. We also believe that the KW Symphony is integral to this magnificent hall, has been currently and long into the future, not only for this community, for the region, but beyond. It is a magnificent performance venue. We want to assure the City of Kitchener Council and our community that the recommendations presented in Mr. Webb's report are ideas, many of which have been considered at various times in the past number of years, but for a variety of reasons, some that include financial, or lack of financial resources, resource strain on personnel, or limited market interest, not all have been taken advantage of. However, some of those ideas, it's time to take a fresh look once again in collaboration with the Centre and the Square. There is no doubt for us that significantly building our revenue is a very high priority. And this is achieved not only through expert management, expense management, but by continuing to produce compelling, innovative programming that inspires our community and attracts individuals into the hall. Examples of that have already been experienced at the Centre and the Square. Another example is some of the work, the innovative work that the KW Symphony has recently been doing. We need to thoroughly investigate all recommendations before we go forward. We agree that the world of performing arts has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. How we engage and attract audiences in this era of changing demographics and changing interests has changed. how funding is provided, even how tickets are sold is changing. We need to continue to challenge our thinking, or we will continue to challenge our financial health. The new programming at the Centre and the Square has an example of how fresh thinking has made a difference, of taking risks, and not all risks, of course, we know are productive. The Intersection series at the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony is another example of how creative partnerships within our community produce unique and groundbreaking performances of which the world takes note. Let's harness this energy that is existing and the desire to make arts and culture in this region the envy of every municipality across this country. In conclusion, the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony Board is committed to working in collaboration with the Centre and the Square to explore each of the recommendations contained in the Web Management Report, while staying aligned to our strategic plan, which was developed about 2 years ago with extensive community input. The Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony is encouraged by the fact that progress is already being made and that dialogue is occurring. This report is only one element of a multifaceted dialogue and an important building block in which we can continue to move forward with the Centre and the Square and the city. We have much work to do, and we look forward to our increasingly positive and mutually beneficial relationship with the Centre and the Square. Finally, the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony Board supports the 4 recommendations that are contained on the first page of the staff report to Committee of the Whole that you have in front of you this afternoon. We believe those recommendations represent an important starting point in our combined journey to a healthy financial sustainability as an innovative and arts and culture organization in our community. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this afternoon.
Thank you, Linda. We have one more presentation, Sylvia DiDonato, who's Manager of Arts and Culture here at the City.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Zaire, staff is pleased to see the collaborative nature of the review process, and we accept the key findings and recommendations in this report. As a first step, the mission and mandate of the Centre and the Square building is to be considered. As phrased by the consultant, what we want the building to do and be. With council support, staff is prepared to move forward in revisiting the mission for Centre and the Square in collaboration with the board, KW Symphony, and other stakeholders and community partners. For this process, an ad hoc committee is recommended to review the mission with specific time-limited terms of reference. Directed by council, we would assemble this group to include the KW Symphony and Centre and the Square, and it would be an open and collaborative dialogue with the community stakeholders to set the stage for facilitated discussion in the next steps. This fulfills the start of the 4 recommendations in the report before you today. Therefore, it is recommended that the same facilitator be engaged from the start of this process to guide these future decisions. Also, we intend to operate within the city's strategy, which currently supports the investment in cultural amenities acknowledged as central to a healthy community and recognized as an economic driver. Performing arts inspire and provide meaningful ways to bring people together, contribute to well-being, and help develop an innovative, creative economy. In that context, the Kitchener Economic Development Strategy also outlines cultural vitality as a significant factor for innovation in a diverse creative economy for the local area. Staff is currently mapping out a process for a 2015 arts and culture strategy, well-timed, for aggregating information from a variety of sources, including the report that we have before us today. The next strategy will identify common themes, topics, and initiatives, including the discussion around Centre and the Square. Therefore, in the context of this alignment through the lens of a revisited mission for Centre and the Square, we welcome the opportunity to engage in the process to ensure that the facility serves the community well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some questions are starting to come in, but I think we're going to go to our delegation, public delegation first, and then we can have an uninterrupted time of questions and discussion. Chris Varga. Is Chris Varga here?
Yes, may I go to the end of the queue because I'm...
We are at the end of the queue. This is the end.
Okay, fine. I didn't have much yet. I just learned about this meeting today, so I cobbled this together. I'm really happy to have a chance to speak here on this issue, and I would like to present an aspect of the presentations at Centre in the Square that probably has not been covered yet. Now, I want to state up front that I am not familiar with the financial underpinnings of the workings of Centre in the Square or the reasons for the financial difficulty at Centre in the Square. But I have no doubt that if we want to host top musical, theatrical, artistical talent, as well as other cultural events, then we as a society must be willing to fund this enterprise. If it is purely commercially based, if it is to be a purely commercially based venue with an interest in presenting only big name shows, then I am less inclined to see the need for funding. But if we want to support the arts, especially Canadian artists and artists who are need to be supported at the local level, then we need to fund the infrastructure necessary for these artists to present their talents, which of course includes the performance venues, which makes that possible. Now, many of us see this prime arts and culture venue as a public trust. If we want to bring culture to people who are leading lives short on culture, if we want to extend these cultural offerings to people who crave culture but can't currently afford it, and I hate to say this includes a lot of artists who have devoted themselves wholeheartedly to their craft, but do not themselves have the means to attend these venues. And of course, as well as to provide a cultural venue for people who are already regulars at Centre in the Square, skip down here. We really need to invest in the public arts venue that shows off our local and national talent, host shows that bring worldwide talent to local audiences. But as long as Centre in the Square remains a venue mostly devoted to a segment of the society who can afford the high ticket prices, which might be seen by some as an expedient to the financial viability of Centre in the Square, then I will say that if this excludes a large portion of the public, then investing in this may be seen as a losing proposition and questionable on behalf of members of the public. Now, my proposal is that we wholeheartedly support the venue with the condition that Centre in the Square be opened up fully and generously to the public who deserves to be there, wants to be there. I am, and can potentially be there. I am proposing that cultural, especially a culture, especially non-commercial, non-popular culture, be funded and supported, and that this be opened up to the general public. If shows move to a more commercially based content, as I said before, then I can see that these shows can be close to funding themselves, which could be an important aspect of what happens at Centre in the Square, but not the main purpose. I am proposing something quite radical here. I am proposing that Centre in the Square become the first venue in North America to boast full house performances each and every time, which may well include opening, which necessitates opening up low-cost tickets to anyone who wants to come, yet cannot currently afford it. We may all be surprised at how many people would turn out to share in the cultural experiences with those who are already sold on the value of the arts, but in this case, for whom ticket prices are already out of reach, are simply out of reach. Make this openness to extending tickets to a wide audience a condition for all presenting organizations, and also create a massive public outreach campaign to bring in the public to share in the cultural experiences, one and all.
Chris,
I'm just concluding here.
Chris. Okay, your time has expired, so could you wrap it up, please?
I'll finish up here. Is it reasonable to say that we could expect full house attendance, and why not? Can we say that we expect Centre in the Square to bring in the public for its publicly funded events and devote itself to this? Can we say that Centre in the Square must do whatever it takes to achieve this goal, even if it means giving tickets away? Why not? I will venture to say that if Centre in the Square consistently were to host a full house, shows that the rationale or justification for funding would be amply demonstrated, and that Centre in the Square would be able to make a much stronger case to City Hall and to the public for ongoing and magnanimous support for this public venue with such enormous potential. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, there are starting to get some questions here. I would ask that you ask specific questions of specific people, and if it's to more than one person, then state that right up front as well. And for those who have been speaking, you can just probably stay right at your speakers and just press your button if you wish to answer a question. And so no statements or debate at this point in time, strictly questions. Councillor Ineski.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers in terms of their presentation this afternoon. I have just a few questions. One question to Linda Faby, and that is in regard to the Conrad Centre and the Symphony being there. The Symphony started initially having their offices at the Centre in the Square as part of the development. As part of the development of the Centre in the Square, and then over the last several years moved over to King Street with the help of Manfred Conrad in establishing the Conrad Centre. Was that move a move for marketing purposes, or was it a financial move to save money? What's the background about that, and what your thoughts may be of staying there or relocating back?
Press that button and then I'll click in your microphone. Okay, go ahead.
Through the chair, thank you. That's an excellent question, and I do believe there's been some media interest in understanding what had happened. And I'll answer as best I can. I was just new on the board when this change happened. Currently, the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony offices are located at the Conrad Centre for Performing Arts, right downtown Kitchener. And until about 5 years ago, were housed, I understand it was in the basement area of this Centre in the Square. I may be mistaken about that, but I do believe it was in the basement area. My understanding is that at that time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was a need for expanding business interests and area for the Centre in the Square staff. As well, the Symphony was growing and looking for expanded spaces as well. The Conrad Centre became available, and so the Symphony staff and management determined to make that move. That has worked well for the Symphony to this point because it does provide an unrestricted area exclusively for the use of the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony in terms of a boardroom, there's office space, a performance area. And in fact, some of our performances are now presented at the Conrad Centre, and also provides a small rehearsal area. That does not suggest that the Centre in the Square is irreplaceable. It just has worked really well for the business aspects in the last 5 years. And if the second question, I'm going to anticipate the question would be, well, would the Centre would the KW Symphony consider a move back? I think we would need to have a thorough investigation conversation around space and business opportunities with the Centre in the Square, and no recommendation will be overlooked.
Perfect. Thank you very much. My next question is to Mr. Duncan Webb. Excellent report that you had put tons of information and background analysis, which was just awesome. But I do have a couple of questions to ask you. Your recommendation at the end basically was a smallest level change, although you did provide 3 other options. Why didn't you want to take one of the drastic options instead?
In a word, because I don't think the current option is failing in any meaningful way. It ain't that broke, so there's no need to fix it.
So your confidence is based on your interviews and analysis that the current administration and board members are able to possibly work things out subject to working hard and negotiating.
Right. So the 2 things that have to happen are that the board needs to be able to keep board discussions at the board table rather than allowing elected officials to get pulled into things like Friday nights versus Saturday nights. And the second thing is that board members who are not council members, who are meant to be independent, need to feel more empowered to act on behalf of Centre in the Square rather than acting directly for the city. They need to feel that independence of being part of a separate organization. And if those 2 things can be achieved, I believe that the current structure works.
Okay, a couple more questions. You indicated in your presentation this is like the 333rd study of all the work that you've done over the many years. How would you how would you analyze the recommendations you made to other groups, and I don't know who they are, in terms of their success in following your recommendation? Did it always follow through, or were there other challenges, or how do we fit into the other groups? Because you did compare us to other municipalities as different scenarios.
So you mean the way that everyone has reacted, or the probability that
you're giving us a small level change. Maybe the other organizations needed to have a more drastic change, and they follow through with it, or did they not?
I hope this will sound like the right answer in about 30 seconds. So the single biggest problem with municipally owned performing arts centers is defining and measuring success, right? And the challenge here, which is the challenge we've been having with all of these other buildings around North America that are either owned and or operated by municipalities, is getting a clear definition of what success means and how to measure your progress towards that. And so this project is a lot about those same issues. It's encouraging you to become much more explicit in what you want that building to do for you, and then giving you stronger tools to measure your success towards the achievement of those goals. So where we've ended up is a little bit different, but the fundamental idea that success depends on your ability to define it and then measure it in ways that staff and governance of this organization can move forward in a way that you're comfortable with and that you can hold them accountable to, that will solve a lot of the tension and the problems around this building.
Thank you. And my final question is, you did compare an analysis to other cities across Canada, Winnipeg, Regina, etc. When I looked at the analysis in your report, Winnipeg is the only big city in Manitoba. Regina, another big city, not surrounded by any other large cities. Kitchener-Waterloo is surrounded by London, Hamilton, GTA. We're stuck in a very dense area, which may be great, but on the other hand, maybe not great. Is that a problem or not a problem? Because we have large municipalities also offer these same type of concerts, venues, theaters, Broadway shows, whatever, that you can just go an hour away. Whereby Winnipeg and Regina, you're hours and hours away from another municipality.
Right. So in a couple of cases, they were more isolated, but we did look at some other places like Hamilton where you have the same issue. So, and to answer the question, being in a denser region like this poses challenges and opportunities. And what's most important for Centre in the Square is to build a regional brand and identity. They've recognized that at the board level. They're working on a branding strategy. So I think that they appreciate the challenge and the opportunity of being within this populous, well-educated, but well-supplied region for the arts and entertainment.
Thank you.
Councillor Etherington.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, I've got a number of questions for Mr. Webb, and then some for Mr. Shantz, and some for Ms. Faby. So I'll run my 5 minutes, then come around again. Is that okay? Thank you. So first question to Mr. Webb. How does this council safeguard taxpayer dollars? I'm asking you, put yourself in my shoes. If, as you suggest, we lessen our involvement in the Centre's board of directors?
I think the more productive way for you to be involved is to get to a point where you can more clearly define what you want the building to achieve for your community and define what success means and what steps you expect to be taken on your behalf, and then hold management and the board of Centre in the Square accountable to achieve those goals. So don't get into the operating issues of Thursdays and Fridays and Saturdays. Focus on the issues of what should this building do for our community, how are you going to do those things, and what recourse do I have if you don't achieve those goals?
Fair enough. So you're suggesting, as part of your recommendation, and it's throughout your report, it's on page 7 and 9 of your summary, and again on page 46, 77, 86 of the main report, you're suggesting that council should, as we move ahead, remove the mayor and the 3 councillors from that board.
Not necessarily. I just think that I want to remove you from the discussion of operational issues. I do not think it is necessarily a bad thing that you are on the board. I think what has been unfortunate is that that board with elected officials has become too directly involved in operating issues rather than being involved in what do we want the building to do for the city, how are we going to get there, and what targets are we going to set as a city to ensure that our resources are being invested wisely in this building.
Thank you. And on page 46 of your main report, quote is, the presence of City Council members on the board has not ensured that capital planning for the major city asset is current and complete. It goes on, but would you link that to the fact that some of council or most of council knew nothing about this $1 million deficit until it suddenly arrived on our plates?
I don't think I'm in a position to know the answer to that.
That's
I
what
really
I
don't
thought
know.
you'd say.
Yeah.
The next question, would you assume that the SITS board would have known for years that it was heading for this type of loss or deficit?
I don't know, but I don't believe that they would have known with any huge amount of time in advance.
And my final question, Mr. Webb, and I don't mean any disrespect in any of these questions, but one of your options is that the city take over the operation of the building. How can that possibly fit with your recommendations elsewhere that we pull back our members from the board?
Well, I haven't recommended you pulling your members out, and it's the problem that I've identified is you're sort of half in and half out. So I've given you options to become more directly involved. I've given you an option to become less directly involved. And the recommendation that I've made is that I think the level of involvement is okay. It just has to be clarified, get you guys involved in the right issues at the building, get other people on that board feeling more independent and empowered to act on behalf of the organization, not go further in or go further away.
Okay, I appreciate that, but I certainly get the message in your report that we should have less involvement on the board. Would you hazard a guess to how many people we should have on the board instead of 4?
Again, I'm not recommending that. My recommendation, it's not how many are on the board, it's what you're talking about while you're on the board. That's the problem. You shouldn't be on the board talking about Fridays versus Saturdays. You should be on the board defining what you want the building to do for your community and acting as a board to get there.
and safeguarding taxpayer dollars. Am I correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
You have about 40 seconds left. Do you want to pass right now? Okay. Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. I know that some of these issues have been brewing for months now, but as far as the public's concerned, it's all fairly new, so I wanted to circle back. My first question would be to Mr. Shantz, and it's regarding, my concern is the clarity of the finances. And the issue that where we began was the Friday, Saturday nights. So if I could, what is the average, if you have an idea, even a ballpark would be beneficial, what is the average amount that the center would profit from, or even gross from the average Friday and Saturday evening, if it were not the symphony?
Shantz?
So I'm speaking off the top of my head, but if I had my phone, I could get the numbers pretty quickly. But I believe that on a rental situation, or if we do well in an at-risk presentation, we can do between 16 and 20,000 on average.
Per evening?
Per evening.
Okay. And currently, what does the symphony pay for those evenings?
So the symphonies is, I believe, between $2,500 and $3,500 a night. And then there would be some recoveries that they would pay over and above that rental amount.
Okay, and I'm not sure which of you would be able to answer this question, but how many Fridays and Saturday evenings are there a year at the Symphony books at the Center in the Square?
I think it's spelled out in the report. I think they use around 23 weekends. The season typically runs from September to May.
Okay,
And that's also the center's prime season.
1 second, if I could.
I think those are good questions. In terms of the numbers, I think we should probably get some accurate information that we can share with back to council.
Certainly. So I'll move on from that. So just, again, so a quick calculation going from the low number of 16. Now, the delta here is $310,000 a year, that from the rough numbers. Okay. My concern is that how is that accounted for? I'm not sure. Perhaps Mr. Maya could respond. I know, for example, when Kitchener Minor Hockey gets a subsidized rate, that goes towards our grants, and that's transparent and funded. So, is this accounted for? This, what I would perceive to be a in-kind grant. How is it accounted for, and how is it transparent?
I can answer that very quickly. In terms of the it's not as a grant. If the scenario that you just described, it just goes as that much less in the bottom line, period. The rent shows at the $25,000 or $3,000, whatever it is, or the 16 or 20, whatever it is, and that the rest of it, the difference, does not appear anywhere on the financial statements.
Okay. See, I guess there's an issue there, because if the current number I have is $190,000 subsidized by the City of Kitchener, but if this is accurate, we're leaving, by the building we own, we're leaving a minimum of $310,000 on the table, going by the low numbers. So I'm not sure how that is transparent to the public, and I guess I'll follow up with that in a minute.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? No? Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, I'd like to first start off and ask Linda a tough question. You may not be able to answer it, but what are your feelings personally towards the idea of a complete merger between the Center in the Square and the Symphony?
Through you, Mayor Zare, I'm not certain it would be appropriate to share a personal opinion since
I'm sorry, I've clicked you off. Could you just press your button again, please?
Try that again? Okay,
go
thank you. Through you, Mayor Zare. I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to share a personal opinion since I'm here representing the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony Board, and so I guess I'd just leave it at that.
That's fair enough. It probably wasn't a fair question on my part, so Thank you.
We can talk later.
I have a number of questions for Mr. Webb.
Okay.
Starting with this question of one of the recommendations you make deals with the merger of the center and the square. Does that type of action grow revenues, or what is your concept in doing that?
It has the potential to grow contributed income and reduce operating expenses. So it doesn't really drive ticket sales per se, but a larger combined organization with a certain scale and reputation is able to attract more private sector philanthropy, public sector support, and because of that economy, that combination, they're able to pursue operating economies that reduce expenses.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. But it's not something that's going to grow revenues from ticket sales as much. Yeah. It's more on the other end. Did you speak to all members of the board, or when you were going through your study?
No, but the offer was extended to all members of both the Symphony Board and the Center and the Square Board. I think we hit more than half of both of those boards, at least a majority.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get an opportunity to speak with you. But, were you able to speak with the former chair, for example, of the center?
Tim Jackson?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I had a phone chat with Tim. He wasn't in town. But
I was surprised in your report and dealing with governance at the center and the square that you haven't discussed. There was change in the governance 5-6 years ago in the way the board operated. Prior to that time, all members of the board, in addition to serving on the board, also served on one of the committees. There was a finance committee, a human resources investment committee, so that a board member spent considerably more time and was more aware of what was happening at the center. But then, at that point in time, an executive committee was set up, and as a result of that, the general board meetings, there was less time devoted for general board meetings, with the intent that board meetings should deal more with governance than other issues. And to me, that somewhat explains why I'm quite surprised when I read your report and find out how much time members of council were spent arguing on operations. I don't recognize that. Really, because, as I say, a lot of that detail came under the realm of the executive committee, and because there have been fewer meetings, I find it's not amazing that some of the newer board members aren't quite sure of where they sit as to what their responsibilities are in relation to what the city is. So that really isn't a question. I'm
just going to say, this is a question.
Yeah, I wanted.
Only.
Well, my question was, I wondered why he hadn't touched on that issue of the setting up somewhat of a different governance.
I can answer it as a question, which is I'm glad you raised that. I hadn't heard that particular issue about that previously you were all on committees, but I think that the situation you described is certainly part of the reason why the situation is as it is today, and it suggests to me, again, that minor changes might go a long way to improving the productivity of the board.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, your 5 minutes is up.
Up?
Oh, a long time ago.
I didn't talk that long. I want to make a comment, though, when the comment...
Well, comments we haven't even started comments yet. This is question period. Councillor Glenn Graham.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. So I'll start off, first of all, by acknowledging the Executive Director of the KW Art Gallery, who's here, Shirley Medill, and just like to ask a question on the gallery's behalf. And was that considered as part of the partnership here and in terms of funding? And have you experience with other art galleries that have been part of the partnership environment in other cities?
Yes, and here, as elsewhere, the art galleries tend to get short shrift. They are seen as the sort of the minor tenant. They have had some struggles to get sort of attention, and just given the scarcity of resources for the building and what can be maintained, the art gallery has struggled a little bit to get their sort of share of the pie in terms of being able to improve their space. I think it's great that they're there, and I hope that they continue to be there if the space continues to work for them.
So their funding wasn't really looked at in terms of this context. Okay. The second question pertains to the concept of being a regional facility and having a brand that is regional in nature and an identity for both the Center and the Square and the Symphony. So if it's meant to be regional, we're talking a lot about Kitchener, and that's right because you're here before us. But I don't hear a lot about Waterloo and certainly nothing about Cambridge. Was that considered? In terms of contributions and working with them?
Right, so we looked at contributions. We met with representatives of other communities. We think that the building has to have a regional focus in terms of attracting audiences and in terms of fundraising. But again, you need to decide what you want the building to do for you first, and then we figure out they figure out how to make it more regional while still serving what you want it to do for the city.
The last question is about Economics 101, demand and supply and the ticket prices and things like that. And we have this tension between wanting to have artistic integrity and wonderful shows that might be exploratory and commercial activity that drives revenue. Did you look at all on the concept of ticket prices and perhaps even pay what you can as an option, as was mentioned by one delegation, and that whole concept of demand and supply and that sliding scale and where these organizations might look?
So we brought in a sub-consultant on this project, a company called Price Whispers that's based in Toronto, and they are essentially an analytics firm, and they look at ticket prices for all shows. And we did a fairly deep analysis of ticket prices and revenue and attendance at all Center and the Square shows for a period of time. And we believe that this building, as with every other building in the sector, needs to pay more attention to dynamic pricing and having the tools that allow them to do what it takes to maximize yield in a building, moving prices up and down the way that airlines do and beyond in order to bring in more money and serve the community in a more effective way. So it's the future for all of these buildings. Center and the Square is no different in that regard.
I heard you say dynamic pricing, and I thought that's what it meant, so thank you for that. Mr. Mayor, at the appropriate time, I'd be glad to move the recommendation. Thank you.
Come back. Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. Interesting listening to the different questions, and so some of my questions have been answered through that. But I do have a number of different ones. Mr. Webb, so I have a couple of questions for you. In looking at the different venues that you looked at through North America and some of the different markets that I believe that they support, did you find that those markets sustained the same significant changes that we have seen within this marketplace, within this region, in terms of employment and the education component as well. I mean, there's a couple of different factors, right? We've seen a real nosedive in our manufacturing. We've seen an increase in our tech sector, but we also have sort of been on par with some of our academic. So are they the same components that these other marketplaces that you looked at had?
I would suggest that this is probably one of the more dynamic markets in the country because of the combination of proximity to Toronto and everything that's going on in the GTA. Secondly, the presence of 4 universities in the region, the rise and fall, and hopefully rise again of the tech sector here, the loss of the manufacturing sector. So my answer is there's more going on here than some of these other places like Saskatoon is a bit more sort of stable as a market. But I would suggest that those changes represent opportunity as much as they do challenge.
Okay, thank you. Are these other markets, these other centres that you were looking at, are they struggling in the same manner as we are seeing the Centre in the Square, or completely different?
Well, all the performing arts is, as a sector, is struggling across North America for the issues, the reasons I described, the cost disease and sort of audiences and funding. The buildings are all facing the same challenges of sort of balancing their budget with some tenants that pay what might be perceived as being close to market rate rent, and other tenants that pay something that's substantially less than market rate rent, as the deal was going in. And symphonies, and even more dramatically, symphonies are challenged all around the world with this productivity problem, and the fact with kids not being taught music in the same way in schools, the struggles that they have in generating new audiences, and the need that they have for capital in order to develop the kinds of innovative programs that KWS is developing in order to find new sources of revenue.
Okay. That was quite the answer. I'm trying to sort of analyze what you're saying at the same time and formulate my next question, because I'm not sure that I exactly heard you say that there are. I mean, yes, I understand the. Sorry, that was a very interesting disease that's going around. Oh, Baumol's cost disease. I mean, really, I think in layman's terms, it's donor burnout, essentially. Is that equivalent, or is it more complicated than that?
It's a productivity problem, right? So in any other commercial sector, every year they're smarter about creating what they create. And in our sector, we're stuck. It takes the same time and energy to rehearse and perform. And in a world where costs are always increasing and where productivity is fixed, where you can't gain anything, you can't become faster or more efficient about how you do what you do, you fall behind every year, which essentially means you become more reliant on fundraising every year, which means at a certain point, you've got a problem.
Right. So it's essentially a vicious circle, but you're right. You had said that earlier in your presentation, and I didn't mean for you to have to repeat that. You mentioned something about new private sources of wealth. Can you help us understand where you're seeing these new sources of wealth? I mean, I guess from my perspective as a ward councillor, I'm certainly not seeing that within my own community. There are certainly tiny pockets, but as I mentioned earlier, donor burnout is really, really high. People, you hear all the time saying, I cannot give one more dollar.
Right.
So where are you seeing this?
So I was alluding really to the tech sector and to the entrepreneurs related to that sector. And the problem here is the problem that everywhere, whether it's San Francisco or Austin or anywhere where you have that, those men and women are still focused on making their money, and they're not yet their philanthropic antenna aren't yet up, and they haven't quite gotten to that point. So what the cultural sector has to do is things like what these guys are doing, innovative programming that brings those people in, or some of the innovative programs like what's the physics one that you all did?
With quantum physics.
Right, so working with quantum physicists and doing interesting things to try and get those people intrigued, interested, and move them towards financial support.
Okay. I know I'm out of time, but I'll cycle back through.
Okay. For those of you who aren't familiar with our protocol here, the bell you're hearing is 5 minutes has elapsed, and that's the time that the question is to be asked and answers given. And so that's what we're trying to stick to here so we can go around the horn. Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And questions for Mr. Webb. I really see us kind of dancing around the issue as to, the best way to sort this out. From what I'm hearing from your presentation, of course, from what I've heard from representations for both the organizations, is that at the end of the day, there has to be synergies that need to be found for, and you've said this, as to level of productivity, to ensure that the type of programming is in line, current, and at the same time, they're both able to maximize on the timing as well with the one facility that's available. Am I correct in that assertion?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, because obviously the limitations that can be derived from it, obviously, at the end of the day, they will have to figure out the right working model to ensure that the continued success of it. One of the things that you mentioned for the symphony was more linkages with the universities that are in town. You referred to Wilfrid Laurier, and they have a world-class music program. So can that still be created? Can that direction still be sought out if there are more linkages with Center in the Square along with the KW Symphony?
Yes, we've endorsed the idea of stronger relationship with the university as well as the regional symphonies, sort of any direction they can move for. But with the educational sector, I think the upside for the symphony is more with partnering with the physics department and the engineering schools and the early education and all of that stuff, not just with the music department.
Okay, all right. So that solves that point. Beyond that, obviously, with the funding that the City of Kitchener provides to the Center in the Square, I really see the city, really punching above its weight level with the funding that it has to provide. The $1.4 million that's given by the City of Kitchener to Center in the Square. Do you find that level of funding appropriate to the type of venue, the size of the venue, comparative to other municipalities and other venues that you looked at?
It's not inappropriate.
Okay, well, that's good. So it's not the lack of what the City of Kitchener is providing. It's more of the different various groups that they need to figure out a better working model than what they've been able to do.
But can I just expand the answer slightly to say it's not inappropriate as long as you can define and believe that you're getting that value back. And I think that the problem you have today is that you have not sufficiently or explicitly defined what you want the building to do for you as a community, and because you don't have the ability to measure the value it's giving you, you don't really know whether 1.4 is a reasonable investment or not.
Okay, and that dialogue really needs to be had with obviously the two major anchors of that facility as well as the City of Kitchener on driving the right step forward. So I get that aspect. So thank you. You've definitely clarified. The last question I have is, through your presentation, you mentioned that obviously the various different groups that operate out of that facility, some of them don't necessarily pay the market share. KW Art Gallery is one, obviously. So KW Symphony, are they paying their market share to operate at the facility? And at what level are they are being subsidized otherwise?
I don't think that from a true sort of market rate definition, there's probably less than 5% of the groups in that building would be paying what you would define as market rate, meaning divide up all of the costs of running the building by 365 days a year and charge that number as the rent number. I don't think that anybody, maybe a couple of corporate groups, pay something close to that, but the Symphony is not alone in the fact that what they pay in rent does not come close to recovering the costs associated with them being there.
Okay, actually another question came to my mind as well. In ensuring that there's more level of cooperation amongst the various groups, And obviously, one way to subsidize some of the deficits is to go out there for philanthropic, monies out there in the private sector as well. If they were working better together, would they have better ease in attracting that money from the private sector and more donations as well?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mayor Zaire. I just want to thank Mr. Webb for all of his fine details and work in his report, and all the staff and board members from both organizations for working together. And one of the big takeaways that I get from this is, and it's been alluded to by a few of my colleagues, and it's about being a regional focus. And since you are a resident expert in here, and I'm glad that you're here, the one question that I really would like to know, and I'm trying to think forward, because I really don't want to make a decision about organizations where I think in 10 years we're going to be back to the same place where we are today. So what I'm really thinking about is something 15, 20 years plus. Is there any examples out there in North America from your expertise that is whether municipal run or, let's say, privately run, where there is one head arts organization that runs all of the arts programming, and you have sort of subcommittees or whatever that dynamic is? Is there anything like that out there?
So, the Boston Symphony runs their own hall. I mean, that kind of situation?
No, I'm talking all levels of arts organization, where you have your theater, where you have your symphony, where you have your all levels.
Okay. So there are examples where a city Office of Cultural Affairs runs it, and then there are other examples where an arts council, which is sort of at least an arm's length removed from government, which represents the arts community, runs the building on behalf of the arts community, with tending to have municipal support to do so.
And how are those organizations? Are they successful in their operations, or are they having the same difficulties we are experiencing?
Some of them are succeeding. The problem is that arts councils, when they start running buildings, they get sort of too distracted by all of the stresses and tension of running a building, and they fall down on the work they're supposed to be doing as an arts council, which is supporting the arts community at a broader level.
Okay. I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Councillor Grbanovich.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And maybe I want to just expand a little bit on that last question. Because as you know, Mr. Webb, and if we look at Drayton as an example, I mean, that's an organization that's running numerous theaters as well as being involved in production and all that kind of thing. And I'm not sure if this is where Councillor Ioannidis was going, but is there any models out there where you have a not-for-profit entity that oversees sort of all the major cultural sector players, but then has leads, obviously, that lead each individual one, but at least there's a staff person that that oversees all of them and ensures the big picture is part of the equation?
Yes, a good example, Houston, Texas, they created something called Houston First, which is a separate nonprofit empowered to run all of their arts and entertainment facilities. It includes both, so the arena, convention center, 3 big performing arts facilities, a couple of amphitheaters. It has a dedicated income stream. It has a share of a hotel tax, essentially, to do that, because they couldn't be expected to do that, to be out fundraising to run all those buildings themselves. So it works because it starts with a dedicated income stream. Then they've combined staff and organizations. It's at least 2 arms length removed from government. It's been going for about 2 years now, and it seems to be working fairly well.
Is that a kind of model that could or should be considered here in light of all the different players?
So if you have multiple facilities to throw into the pot to think about common management, that opens up other opportunities for how they could be governed.
Okay. The next question I have just has to do with the impact of casinos on Centre in the Square, and you touch on it a little bit in the report, but I was actually surprised to see that it wasn't sort of touched on more, because my understanding is it's had a fairly profound impact on many of the various playhouses throughout Southern Ontario. And is that in fact the case, that it is a significant issue? And are there any suggestions or best practices that we can learn from in order to try to combat that?
It's a case for performing arts venues all over North America now. The emergence of casinos, they're overpaying for commercial entertainment. They draw from a larger area than a typical performing arts center. They promote those events very heavily. And the way that this building is responding is similar to the way other buildings is. It sort of keeps them honest in terms of how far they stray into the world of pursuing commercial entertainment, recognizing the sort of the competitive muscle of those casinos, and encourages them to stress the things that they have. The things that casinos don't have is the room itself, where you see that entertainment that tends to be pretty awful. And what you have with Centre in the Square is a large, comfortable, and acoustically superior hall, which is what, again, leads us to stress that's what's most important as you build a regional brand, is those particular strengths of the building and its ability to program a little bit of commercial stuff that you can do without competing too directly with the casinos, but have more of an orientation towards cultural programming.
Okay, thank you. And the next question I have has to do with tourism, and I realize you weren't mandated to look at this in the context or eyes of tourism development, but I'm wondering, as we look at the Centre in the Square, as we look at the symphony, as we look at the art gallery, is there more that we could or should be doing that would help the overall situation here, based on your experience in relation to other cities?
I think that hopefully in your next round of cultural planning, you'll take up that idea of cultural tourism more directly. Many of our clients are doing that. The challenge that you have with Centre in the Square is its physical location relative to the rest of the downtown. And the solution I would encourage you to consider is the creation of a cultural district that in some ways physically connects or strengthens connections between Centre in the Square and the downtown area, that makes it easier for that to become a cultural tourist destination.
Okay, thank you. And I too want to just express my thanks to yourself and to everyone who's been part of this process to get us to this point. I know it's been a lot of hard work, so thank you.
5 minutes, good. Okay, we're now going back to a third round. I've got three. I'd like you to consider all three questions and answers in the next 10 minutes, so we leave a full hour for discussion. So, whoops, there goes fourth, there goes five. Still 10 minutes. Councillor Etherington.
Questions to Mr. Shantz. Mr. Shantz, can you just clarify for me, are we talking about a $1 million deficit in 2013 or 1.5? And also, are we looking ahead to a $2 million loss?
We're not looking forward to a $2 million loss. The 1.5 figure is the figure from our audited financial statements. Just over half of that represents amortization and write-downs of the building. So that represents just under $700,000 of a cash loss. The 900,000-ish figure, which I think is the million, is from a statement of operations, which attempts to strip out some of the other things and just look at the operations.
Thank you. Can you tell me, and I don't want to hop on this, but when did the Centre Board of Directors know you would be facing that kind of loss?
It would have been late in 2013 when it became clear that the deficit was going to be of that nature.
and I don't know whether you can answer this, but presumably it takes a period of time for that to accumulate. And why did we as councillors not know about it from the board or from our members on the board?
I have no answer for that. I wasn't reporting to council at that time.
But you did not come to council to report?
I'm sorry, I don't follow.
Or did anyone from the board of directors come to us to say that you were getting into that kind of a loss situation?
As I said, I was not personally involved in reporting to council at that time. But what I can perhaps expand on is that this is an inherently risky business. It is quite possible for the Centre in the Square to lose $100,000 in a week on a show that doesn't do well.
Yeah, I understand.
In addition to that, the 2013 budget was the first budget that was developed entirely with new management. They were also dealing with some programming choices made by previous management, and they also wanted to do their own programming choices. So it was kind of a hybrid year. I think a lot has been learned from it. And in addition to that, there was a bit of a restructure that was underway. And so this isn't just show losses. There were a number of things that sort of crystallized with this deficit.
Did Kitchener's Big Music Fest contribute to the Centre's losses?
Well, the Big Music Fest happened in 2014, so it has nothing to do with the 2013.
Has it contributed to future losses?
The Centre in the Square was looking to get into summer programming, and we knew that that was a very competitive market. And so, yes, the Centre in the Square was looking at doing some summer programming, and the recent music festival did cause us to change those plans and pull back from them. However, I would say that it wasn't a surprise that there was a music festival coming to this region. We knew that it was very competitive.
And as a board member at the Art Gallery, I've heard many suggestions that you subsidize the Art Gallery rent. Do you foresee any changes as far as the Art Gallery is concerned in way of what we're looking at now?
Can you clarify what you're asking?
I'm asking if at the CITS board, are you going to be considering changes to the way you operate with the Art Gallery in way of rents or any other?
I would hope that in the processes that we go forward, that as we go forward, that all parties are involved in discussing how the operations go. I'm not aware of any discussions around what happens to the Art Gallery's rent one way or another. I think that the Art Gallery should be, particularly on the capital side, should be very much involved in some of that planning.
And finally, a question for Linda Faby. Linda, this document suggests you need to find an additional $600,000 to $700,000. How realistic do you think that is?
Go ahead, Linda, if you can give a brief answer to that.
Oh, thank you. I'm always cautiously optimistic. Is that brief enough? That's a struggle. We continue every year to look for new cash revenue, new funding, and probably the greatest energy has gone into more creative programming to attract greater audiences to our performances. Currently, we do have one homemade, if I could use that term, performance that's touring through North America. So we're looking in that venue as well.
Thank you.
Okay, clearly we're not going to be done in 10 minutes for those questions. We will go through them. There are 4 more now. But please try to keep them succinct so we can get to the discussion, because we are to be done by 5 o'clock. Councillor Davey.
Thank you. My question is questions are to Mr. Webb. First on Boemel's cost disease. I find this quite interesting, but your chart on page 6 it looks like it details the expenses per concert typically from 1987-ish to 2005 have gone up 3 times. So my question is, if you project this trend into the future, what does that mean in terms of performing arts going forward? Like, will this eventually plateau, or?
No, it's going to keep going up.
Okay.
This is based on a survey of 50 largest symphony orchestras in the United States. And also in the book, there's reference to the fact that Canadian symphonies face some of the same challenges. So it's a problem today that becomes a bigger problem tomorrow.
And in your opinion, do the recommendations before us address those problems in the medium or long term?
To the extent that they can, yes.
Okay. I want to talk just a little bit more about the preferred rental rates. It wasn't terribly explicit in the report. You did mention TCU Place is moving away from preferred rental rates. Can you comment a little bit more about how common that is and any suggestions on how we should adjust that going forward?
I don't think you can move away from subsidized or preferred rents for key users. We always advocate for at least sort of 3 levels of rental rates in performing arts centers: a commercial rate, a nonprofit rate, and then an even lower rate for resident organizations, groups that you really want to have in the building. You have to accept that they cannot pay the same amount of money to be in the building, but in return, they allow you to deliver value to the community that you wouldn't otherwise have, and their presence in the building allows you to fundraise from the private sector to afford to have them there. So I think that's a basic reality of these buildings. You've got to find a way to afford for them to be there.
Okay, and one last question, and you're looking at the finances of the Centre in the Square. Supposing for a moment that the Symphony did not hold concerts at the Centre in the Square, they had a different facility or something, would the Centre in the Square itself still be in any sort of financial difficulty?
Yes.
Okay, so we've heard that they could recover an additional $300,000 to $400,000 a year, and that wouldn't cover in the long term the deficit that they have.
Part of that is opportunity cost. It presumes, you only make that money up if you replace the symphony with groups who can pay a significantly higher rate of rent.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Fernandez.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, just want to make sure that I'm going to catch all the questions I have. The one I wanted to ask was of Mr. Webb. If the Symphony does not wish to return to the Centre in the Square, do you see that the Centre in the Square can continue to be viable?
I think it would be a very, very sad thing for the building to operate without the Symphony, but other buildings have done it. Miami opened a new concert hall 5 years ago, and the orchestra for whom it was being developed went out of business 9 months before it opened. So they're open, they're operating, they've developed a programming strategy. It's still a sad thing that orchestra is not there.
Okay, thank you. You talked in the recommendations that staff have put forward are essentially yours, only encapsulated in shorter form. Have you seen the recommendations that staff put forward? Okay. One of the, actually I probably need a preamble question to this, and I don't know exactly who it would go to. My understanding is that the Centre in the Square building itself, the facilities, are in dire need.
So what was the question? I didn't catch that.
I'm getting to that question. It's regarding the facilities and how they've gone downhill. How did we get to that point? What was missed? Is that is that a clear understanding of what you saw when you did this consultation?
I think that the economic pressure on the building, combined with the recession, sort of 2008 on, put the focus of the building on operations, and then new management came in, looked around, and the board looked around a little bit more and said, okay, we had to do what we had to do. We need to really sort of catch up on capital maintenance because we've fallen behind. So I don't know if that's exactly the story, but I don't think there was a willful disregard. for the
No,
state of the building.
Okay, and thank you. I didn't expect that it was willful disregard. I kind of was coming to the understanding, as you talked about other areas, that there may have been a focus in one area, and therefore the actual facility, the building, started to get run down. But in the recommendations, and I heard you say earlier that we need to do the littlest we possibly can do, that would not be related to number 3 and 4, which talks about physical improvements.
The governance, yeah, that's it.
Oh, the governance. Okay, thank you. And I think that was all I had for now. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, my first question is for Marcus, and it's to do with the question that was asked, or the response that was given from the Centre in the Square on page 2 of Appendix B, with regards to the first priority there, the recommendation with respect to the new mission statement for Centre in the Square and express goals. You did your last strategic plan when? Was it?
I believe it was 2012. 2012.
And if I read this correctly, it assumes the mandate or the legislation from the 1981 Centre in the Square mission. Is that correct?
Sorry, that our strategic plan was based on that earlier mandate and mission? Yes, correct.
Okay. I just would like you to explain further the response that's in there, because from my perspective, it looks as though the Centre is hesitant to participate in the recommendation of the new mission statement and goals for Centre in the Square. So I'm just looking for you to further explain, because it's suggesting that you do not automatically assume that there be a new mission, it's making a lot of assumptions. So I'm just looking for further clarification on what the Centre's response was.
Right. What we welcome very much is the opportunity to engage with the city about the mission and the mandate, because I don't think we've done that for some time. And so all I'm saying there, all we're saying is that we're not sure that we need a new mission and mandate, but what we do need to do is re-engage the city as to what they want us to do inside the building. So it may be that at the result of it is, yeah, we were right in 1981, and we just need to make that work.
Okay. And my other question is for staff, and I'm going to preface my question with I'm trying to give some context to the community with regards to costs for Centre in the Square and the Symphony. So based on the financials, it's a lot of numbers I'm going to be throwing out there, just so you're warned on that. Based on the numbers that come out of the financial statements here, and based on a population of 230,000 people, understanding that give or take is where we're at for the city of Kitchener, that for Centre in the Square, with just regards to their operating costs, that $6.10 per person per year is what the taxpayer pays, and that's based on the $1.4 million operation subsidy. And that for the Centre in the Square, the capital cost is $1.07 per person per year. And that the Symphony gets, based on the $190,000 operating, plus the $60,000 sustainability fund, that equals $1.09 per person per year. I told you it was a lot of numbers. And if you add all those together, to the per person, I want to be clear, it's per person, not per household, per person per year, the two organizations combined are $8.26. So I'm just looking to see if I've done my math correctly.
Mr. Chapman, okay, you've got your microphone on.
Through you, Mayor, the logic sounds correct. I would just have to confirm whether the sustainability funding was $50,000 or $60,000, but that wouldn't materially change the calculation. I think fundamentally you're in the right ballpark.
Okay. And I do that just, I can make comments later, but I just want to give the context was purely for the community to understand the cost of what these two organizations are within the tax base.
Okay, I've got two speakers left, Councillor Vanich and Councillor Van Graham. You're back on then, Councillor Glenn Graham, for a question in a moment, but then we'll immediately go to the motion related to the that's in front of us. Councillor Urbanovich.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I just want to follow up on the questioning that I had earlier around a model that looks at more of that arts and culture sector together and that Houston model that you described. And I guess, in the context of Kitchener and certainly even, I'll say, Waterloo or the north part of the region, I see a number of facilities that are part of the picture. I mean, there's the Center in the Square, but there's obviously the auditorium, as you talk about. There's the Conrad Center. There's the Registry Theatre. There's the WLU Marine Forester Hall, and there's the Humanities Theatre. Forester Hall holds about 400, and Humanities, I think, is around 700 or 800 and change. So just from a performing arts point of view, we have those 6 venues, not to mention the role that the symphony plays, the art gallery plays. We have our own, as a separate entity, we have the museum that's downtown. I'm just wondering, as we go forward and look at things like the mission and mandate of Center in the Square, that's important, but should that broader context not be explored, or does that complicate things too much and we need to sort of keep things compartmentalized initially and then see where the discussion goes?
I think to bring the auditorium into the discussion with Center in the Square makes sense. I think all those other ones are problematical. The registry runs at a super cheap cost level. I don't think there's anything you could do to reduce the cost of operating that center. They do it very effectively, essentially as a co-op now. You don't want to get involved in operating campus-based university facilities. And the Conrad Center is very much its own thing for the symphony. But I do think it's reasonable to look at Center in the Square and the auditorium together. That, I think, is the opportunity.
Okay, but I guess getting back, though, to my earlier question in terms of looking at sort of related arts organizations, and you brought up the Houston example, when would be the appropriate time to have that broader community conversation? Is it now, or is it part of an evolutionary process and it happens later on? If folks think there's some merit to it.
The step that we've suggested is the first thing you need to do is decide what you want Center in the Square to do for you as a community, and then you can consider if a different governance model is an appropriate way for you to achieve that value. So I think you can ask those questions, but I would encourage you not to ask those questions until you've had the discussion about what is that building to do for us as a community.
Okay.
First.
And I apologize for pushing on this, but I think we need to get our heads around it. But before we talk about what we want the Center in the Square to do for us as a community, is the broader conversation not what do we want arts and culture to do for us as a community? Because I think that really lays the foundation for everything, and everything else follows after that.
Yes, and I'm glad to hear that the cultural planning for next year may address that for you. But I think the combined operation of a set of facilities by one organization, it doesn't really work for when it's sort of purely nonprofit arts organizations. It tends to work when it's combining meeting, event, entertainment, and sports facilities. That's when you're much more likely to see combined management and operations make sense. The way they did in Hamilton with Hamilton Place.
Right.
It's entertainment with convention and sports.
Okay. And so then just my last question then I guess would be to Sylvia, just on that issue, in terms of that broader conversation, can you just talk a little bit more about how that would play out next year around what we want arts and culture to do for our community?
Through you, Mayor Zaire, yes, we're looking at a mapped out process now for 2015.
Lean in a bit further, please.
Right. For 2015, we're looking at a process we're mapping out now to ensure that we have as much input as possible and consulting with stakeholders, including performing arts centers, and including what you describe as larger and smaller venues where these things take place, and working collaboratively with our regional partners as well to ensure that we have an inventory to work from and a strategy that is consistent with the economic and community benefits that are derived throughout the city plan now and into the future.
Okay, and I am encouraged to hear that, and I think in particular it's important that we include sort of all those organizations, yes, the art gallery and folks like the museum, but also folks like Globe Studios and some of the smaller players. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, Councillor Glenn Graham, you had one more question and then the motion.
That's right. And my question actually is exactly on the same topic. It's the applicability of the Houston First model in this community. And I did want to explore further the aspect of how to finance this, because it wasn't, the revenue stream was separate. It was coming from hotels, if I understand correctly, so that any discussion like that in the cultural context would have to include the business community and the hotels specifically. So could you talk about, is there a set kind of structure that there's a separate board and they levy a fee to the hotels? Is that what happens?
This is a more common practice in the U.S. that municipalities or counties make a decision to levy a particular type of tax, and that income stream is dedicated to a particular use, like the sustainability of one or more cultural organizations or an arts district. In Denver, that really is the best model in the U.S. They did this 10-county district called the SCFD. It's about zoos and arts facilities that are funded with a 10-year hotel tax stream. In Broward County in Florida, they used a tax on video cassette rentals, and other places they use it as a tax on rental cars, like in more sort of tourist destinations. But that, you're absolutely right. The income stream is identified and authorized to that particular purpose as the way to incorporate and use that body that then distributes those funds.
So in a nutshell, we have to build a business case with a clear goal and mission first, and then be able to convince the business community to come on board if we were to pursue this kind of thing.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Would you like me to make the motion now?
Yes.
I'm happy to bring forward the recommendation that's in FCS 14-138, all the recommendations below. This is in my ward, and if I could just speak to it very briefly. Mm-hmm. I think that this is, again, an interim step moving towards some kind of strategy that really helps to coordinate the very important institutional aspects of our cultural pillars in the city of Kitchener. There's no doubt that we have great value here. We have to clarify, as has been said, what our goals and what the value is that we're looking for in order to identify how to move forward. I appreciate all the collaboration that's gone on, and I think that that's a great asset to build on. There's no doubt we have a great facility to build on. We have to think of these things as partnerships, and so it's certainly not about an individual stake. It's about the region growing together and the value each organization brings. There's no clear solution, and I guess that's appropriate because you're right, it's not for us to debate here at Council about a calendar. But what it is meant to do is to give the organizations the mandate to say, we believe in what you're doing, let's clarify what it is that we want, and then we'll ask you to try and work out the details with some facilitation. So thank you again for all the guidance. I think that this is a great interim step. I look forward to the outcome.
Okay, we're speaking now to the resolution which you have in front of you. Try not to repeat the same things that have been said before and going into the questions that we dealt with. So let's deal only with the recommendations that are in front of us now. Speaking. Well, you're in the queue. You can speak to. Okay, well, make a comment right now, but there is a motion on the floor.
Right, I just wanted to make
Councillor
an
Galvin.
additional one, and I thought if I could do that, then everyone could comment
All
on
right,
it.
go ahead.
Do you want me to make all my comments now? I know I'm jumping ahead in the queue, or just the motion that I...
The motion that
Okay.
you were suggesting as an amendment.
Okay, and I'll make my comments after, but I would be looking to bring forward the motion to have the representation from council be switched to the mayor and one councillor. And I'll make my comments when it's my turn.
Okay.
So the mayor, from 4 to the mayor and one councillor.
Okay, now going through get back in, yes. Councillor Etherington, speaking to the motion and the amendments, not formally on the table yet, but speaking to that matter.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the amendment. I certainly want to see that happen. I'll be supporting the recommendation, but to put it bluntly, in relation to the key recommendation made in the report that we've been talking about, I believe that we're going to pay $67,000 to a consultant to tell us what we already knew, that the centre and the symphony need to kiss and make up and talk to each other. I'm very uneasy about some of the findings in the report because as a councillor I want to know more or less. I want to know more, not less, about spending this kind of these kind of taxpayer dollars. I don't like the theme throughout the document, and I already made that obvious, that the mayor and councillors need to limit their involvement in the centre board. And I would also want to know in a timely manner, any time the centre is approaching this type of financial crisis, I don't have to remind people that we're accountable to our taxpayers who ultimately pay for this kind of loss. So I'm a little disappointed in that super cautious recommendation, but I will support what is obviously continued discussions to try to solve this ongoing problem.
Councillor Yunetsky.
Yes, thank you. I too will be supporting this motion. I think we need to do our homework even better. We do have an excellent concert hall here in Kitchener-Waterloo, one of the best in North America, actually, and I can clearly speak on that because I visited different concert halls and when I go to concerts in North America, plus that when I do interviews on the radio station I'm involved with, those artists also tell me how great a concert hall we have here and very appreciative of it. We do not have a unique scenario of not filling in seats and making enough money in concert halls, as pointed out by the consultant, that it's a North America-wide problem and it's not unique to us. So it's nothing that we should be fearing because other municipalities are probably going through the same problems and trying to resolve it as we are. We have to look what the Centre in the Square needs to do for our community. We're trying to balance touring groups and different people that are performing and coming in, renting the hall, or we search them out, versus local group that wants to use it. And we try to accommodate both, and I still personally think we should be doing that, trying to accommodate both. But I also know at the same time it's going to be a struggle to make the bottom line balance out. And I think that in the future we're still going to have to expect running a deficit, and I'm prepared to live with that. And the reason I say that is we have deficits in other components of our municipality. Where there's the Kitchener's Farmers Market that we're always subsidizing on a yearly basis. We have a transit system that always needs support, although it's regional. It still only pays for half, part of the fares only pays for half the costs of really operating it. It just needs to be expected that if you want to have transit, if you want to have a farmer's market, you may just have to expect the taxpayer to pay their extra share. If you want to have a centre in the square, the same proposition holds true for them. I think also that the building of the centre in the square should really not be left in the centre in the square's hands in terms of trying to make sure the maintenance of it and operating and fixing the parts that need to be replaced or fixed or whatever. yet at the same time trying to operate the arts component and bringing in shows and operating that way. We have other buildings here that are the responsibility of the city, like the auditorium, various arenas, the farmers market, and we are totally responsible for its maintenance, replacement, fixing it up, and doing whatever has to be done. The center square seems to be given an arm's length worth, and I think if it comes under our responsibility as part of a taxpayer, because it's our building, then I think that's the way we should basically go for that. I want to also mention a comment that was raised earlier from Councillor Gazzola about the change of the executive board and how that all unfolded. And I have to agree that has changed from what it was a few years ago, because there were various committees that I understand. And now with the executive committee, they seem to be holding more responsibility, making recommendations to the board as a whole, and the board basically confirms and discusses it as well. So the individual board members have sort of maybe a lesser role and just basically leave it to the executive board to handle that. And that's basically the way I see it unfolded. Some of the decisions that are made in terms of groups coming in and using the facility, whether it's a touring group, Broadway shows, or whatever, the board members have very little to do with that. That total responsibility falls on the shoulders of Sandra Bender, who's the CEO. She's the one with her staff that go out, look for the shows, do the rentals, and make the decisions as to whether it will be a good show or a bad show, what the rates will be, etc. And sometimes you're lucky, and sometimes you're not. I know we had Whoopi Goldberg as to be one of the examples. She was supposed to bring in good bucks, and actually ended up being a very poor result in the end. But that's why it's called all risk in terms of trying to make those decisions. And that's just sometimes you look out, and sometimes you basically don't. So in the end, I'm still prepared to support this. I'm still prepared to see the missions and all the priorities revisited and look and go forward. And I still think that we have an excellent building here that we have to maintain for the use of the public and maintain here in the city of Kitchener.
Councillor Galway-Seelock, could first of all you formally bring forward your motion, your amendment rather.
You want me to bring it forward?
You get it on the table now, okay. Formally, and then make your comments. Okay. Formally,
I'd like to bring forward an amendment that would bring the makeup of the Centre in the Square board to the mayor and one councillor to be appointed to the board.
Can I just ask for a little clarification? We'll stop your timing here for a second. The recommendations here today are not making any specific decisions, and in this particular case, I think you should perhaps just word the motion to investigate or move in this direction. That would be the intent. But there are some, I think the legislation and bylaws under which the Centre in the Square is incorporated may not allow that without further action. So certainly state the intent of what you're doing. I'm not necessarily saying I'm opposed to it. I just think the wording should be changed to allow for that to be explored, that be the intent.
Can we not give that direction, though, even if it requires a Centre in the Square bylaw change?
Right, direction can be given, yes. I'm just simply saying that none of the other motions that we are dealing today are specific, and we're allowing for all of that information to be gathered before any of the specific decisions are made. But
I realize that, but we're coming up on this one we're coming up on a deadline because we're up for reappointments probably before any of this is going to come back, right? So if we're going to affect change on this, we've got to do it basically now versus later, because our makeup of the board comes forward in November.
It's in the hands of council.
Well, I'm willing to hear from other members of council, but at this time I'm going to leave it as the change, and if there is any flow through from that staff can report back then. If it's not a possibility, I guess I can massage it a little bit that way. My comments are, the whole purpose of me trying to bring forward the number of $8.26 per person per year is just to give the community some perspective of what it costs them to operate these two organizations within the City of Kitchener. And they're very important organizations within the City of Kitchener and the region, as it's been noted. And I think to give that context is important because I think we're about to embark on a very large discussion. And that discussion is going to involve the community, in my opinion. I think it's really important to have a refresh and a look at the mission and mandate for the Centre in the Square, especially if we've heard that the strategic plan from 2012 was based on legislation and understandings from 1981. That actually really surprises me. We need to hear from the community on what the new mission and mandate looks like and what that then in turn looks like for the context of the KW Symphony. I believe a lot of answers will flow from that direction, and it will help us move forward as a community. I agree that council's role is to set and help set that mission and mandate for the building, and I think we need to do that in conjunction with the larger community. And having said that, I believe that that is council's role. We don't need 4 members of council on the Centre in the Square board, which represents approximately 28% of the board. We will have our opportunity to speak and will continue on a yearly basis to hold the board accountable for their actions every year at budget time or any other time that it would come forward. As I stated before, I believe now is the time to make that change to the board appointments for council because we are coming up on those changes come November. So I feel that that's an important piece to show that council is willing to look at different opportunities to try and make this a success in our community. Thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
I would have liked to have had a few minutes more than 5 minutes. I just want to touch back on a little bit of history on this, but I'll try to move quickly. Okay?
And you can come back in the second round if you need to.
Well, by that time I'll have forgotten what I was going to say. My history with the Centre in the Square is quite lengthy. I've had the privilege to sit on the board for the last 7 or 8 years, but I have a history that goes back to the 1970s. I was here when the council of the day was arguing this very same issues. This vote, the decision to build the Centre in the Square came back to council 2 or 3 times before it was successful. And it finally did succeed in going forward, but before they could really get going to it, it was challenged at the OMB. I was deputy city treasurer at the time, and I had to go to the OMB on behalf of the city to answer questions on the Centre in the Square. And some of the questions were directed to me from the mayor of the day, who was opposed to the establishment of the Centre in the Square. But my dealings was dealt with the financial viability of the Centre in the Square. And my answers today will be no different than they were 35 years ago. The Centre in the Square is an arts and culture venue, and there are no profits in arts and culture. And it's one of the problems we had at the time when we established it was how do you define and measure success? And that's really difficult when you're dealing with arts and culture. It's not something that can make a profit. It was established with the intent of letting all the groups in our community participate. So therefore, we knew right away that was going to be a lot of subsidization. Now, it has flourished, in my opinion, for 35 years. Yes, we've run into a bit of a hiccup now. To be honest here, with the capital side of this whole operation, City Council has been really stingy for 35 years, and I can also take part of the blame because I sat on the other side of the fence on the staff position and often recommended being stingy because we were worried. We looked here, and we have the tendency here to look at the short term. We look at a very short term. Our term is 4 years, and that's what we look at. So we get concerned about costs and the increase in taxes. And therefore, we have not put the capital monies into the Centre in the Square that we should have for the last 35 years. And it culminated last year when no longer could we do that. As far as I'm concerned, the whole question here is a question for the new city council. We have to decide, city council first has to decide what do they want out of a center in the square. There's no sense, to me, sending it back to the members of the center in the square. To me, I question that. City council has to first decide what do we want. And the second part of that is, in order to do that, I think we need to have public engagement, which is every man, woman, and child in the community to give an opportunity as to what they think the center in the square should be, what they think it should look like, so that they can tell what they consider should be a proper subsidization. We need to go to the public. We will hear from the stakeholders, but we need to hear from the person on the street. Now, this decision can't be made until a new council comes in and the council decides. But what I would like to see happen in the interim between now and a new council is for staff to be going out to the public and asking the public, okay, after 35 years, what are your thoughts on the center and the square? Here's what's happened. Here's what might happen. Here's what it's going to involve. So basically, I cannot say I don't support the recommendation that's before us. To me, it really goes in the wrong direction. I think if we can answer, and if a new city council can answer what they expect and how they're going to measure whether there is success, well, then everything else will fall into place. Then the whole issue of capital, everything else will fall into place as to how the organizations get along. So I want to say a quick word about the symphony and the center. They're there trying to work for our community, and they're all volunteers. So I find it hard to find fault with them. These things have not been personal issues. They're both interested in the community. So I also would like to comment on the other amendment of the mayor and council. To me, that's premature. It serves no purpose. We did that. We cut back on Heritage Committee, cut it back, and then I found I continued as a layperson coming to the meetings, and oftentimes there wasn't even a representative from City Council. So that, to me, that's a moot point that we can deal with. Our issue is, what do we expect out of that venue? Thank you. If you gave me extra time, thank you.
Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And the way I see this, the issues that I'll be supportive of the motion that's before us, but I see that we should have started this conversation a long time ago. And it's rather disappointing that we had to come to this junction, which looks to be a desperate situation, where now we're finally starting to engage in dialogue, and the groups are starting to engage in dialogue, which should have been starting to look at a common path far earlier. So these are very first steps, and so that's why I will be supportive of it. But as a part of these first steps, we need to ensure that the community as a whole has an opportunity to provide their input in deciding, as others have said, what the long-term vision for the center and the square needs to be. And as to the funding that the City of Kitchener already provides, I've said this earlier, that I really see that the City of Kitchener taxpayers are already subsidizing on behalf of the region. The regional municipalities, the residents of regional Waterloo receive considerable benefit as to the what comes out of these organizations and amenities that are available, and yet are not necessarily paying their fair share. So I would hate for additional weight to be forward and extended to already burdened taxpayers. And that's why we need to ensure that the groups that are as part of the Center of the Square need to engage and come and to look for a cooperative relationship, ensuring that long-term success and viability in this community.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you, Mayor Zaire. For me, it comes down to a pretty simple equation. It's about what type of community do you want to live in. Do you want to live in a stagnant and less vibrant community, or do you want to live in a vibrant and a community that has some animation to it, that has some excitement that wants to attract businesses, wants to attract talent, create jobs? And that to me is the bottom line. And I think all the stuff that has happened in the past, or what's going to happen in the present, I think this is a first step, and I think it's a step in the right direction. And I think we should encourage all of the arts community that we should have this broader discussion on arts in general, and which is going to be happening with Sylvia's comments. So I'll be supportive of the motion recommendation.
Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you very much, and it's interesting to listen to some of the history, as Councillor Gazzola informed us. Was enlightening for me. I support at some level the recommendations that we've come forward, but I think we've spent a lot of money to learn to some degree what some of us already suspected. I am concerned that we are going to go around and around on some of the discussions on an issue that I think can be resolved at the very basic level between the Symphony and the Centre and the Square. But that being said, I think that there's more to this whole situation that meets the eye. We are in a bit of a quagmire. It is unfortunate that we've learned this late in the hour about the situation. I do believe, as Councillor Singh mentioned, we should have learned about this much sooner. It's very important that we understand where the taxpayers' dollars are going. Councillor Galloway-Selak talked about it being $8.26 per person. I don't really understand how the average person is going to be able to understand that, because for them and for many people, arts and culture is a nice to have. It's a extra. And if for a family of 5, it's $41.35. Then that could be a tank of gas for some people. So it's a very different way of looking at it. Arts and culture, as Councillor Gazzola said, it's not a profitable thing. It's not something that we're out to make a profit. It makes our city interesting. It makes our city inviting. It brings nuances that if all we do is eat and work and sleep, it makes us very boring. So I do think that we need to send a message. Just backtracking a little bit, I'm not sure that we need to have a facilitator. I think we have so many good people here within our staff, within the boards, that could sit down and have a conversation. We have really the guidelines in this document. Everything here is telling us what we need to do, how we need to address it, and how we can move forward on that. And I think there are wise people here who can do that, who can move forward. I also think it would be, that's why I asked the question about the new wealth. We need to send a message to the younger people. Your parents supported Centre in the Square and the Symphony and the Registry Theatre and all of those arts and cultures and the art gallery, the museum. It's your turn now. And I know you're busy making money, and I know that there are things in your life that you want, but this is an important part of our community and a part of our community for your children. So take a look at maybe what is now your turn to help out a number of organizations that are very crucial to our city.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I have some concerns. I still have some concerns about how a facilitator will identify the priorities and differences between the Centre and the Square and the Symphony. Because when you're talking about things as specific as evenings, it's one or the other. So I have some concerns there. I also have, obviously, as I raised earlier, I have some concerns about the transparency in terms of the funding. I mean, to be clear, the Centre and the Square is fairly transparent, but people need to understand that the Symphony, for example, although we're in cash, we're giving $190 plus another $50,000 or $60,000. There's a subsidy coming from the Centre and the Square, who we own, of an additional $300,000 to $400,000. So all in, the Symphony is, in terms, if they were comparable to any other grant, they'd be probably among the highest organization in terms of funding from the City of Kitchener. My point in this is I'm prepared to support the recommendations. I'm concerned about the parameters around coming back. My concern when I look at this is it's going to come back to City Council and it's going to have significant operating cost implications, and that's not what I want to see. I'm extremely, we dropped the ball in the past with our capital on the building. We have to catch up with that. You can't fight capital costs. You can't have the building come down. But in terms of operating costs, there has to be a way the facilitator can work with the Centre and the Square and the Symphony where they realize that there can be no more operating funds coming from the City of Kitchener than what is already there.
Councillor Verbanovich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and I will support the motion that's before us, and I will support the amendment as well. People have been commenting about the fact that we're finally getting to the point of having dialogue between the Symphony and the Centre and the Square, and I think the harsh reality of it all is that difficult times result in difficult discussions and ultimately difficult decisions. But I also think that everyone's recognizing that we've reached a point where we need to look at some of these issues differently. And part of looking at them differently is looking at some of the issues that have been identified in the motions that are before us. But I also think part of looking at it differently means looking at the whole arts and culture sector comprehensively. And that was where some of my line of questioning went earlier today. And I think as we talk to people in the arts and culture sector, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to the Symphony or the Centre and the Square or the Art Gallery or the museum or Globe Studios, and the list can go on and on, the Registry Theatre. These are not unique challenges. Everyone is struggling with it. And part of the reality in all of this is that, yes, when it comes to surveys, arts and culture does not always come up as a number one priority because of this issue of needs and wants. And yet when it comes to how do we ensure employee attraction and retention into the region, how do we ensure the level of quality of life that people are looking for, issues around arts and culture always come up as being a priority. And so I think somehow as a community we need to engage in that comprehensive discussion and come to terms with that, come to terms with the fact that, people's views in one sense are not lining up with their views from another aspect around that. And I think, and I hope that the process that Arts and Culture is undertaking next year is really going to start to come to grips with all of that, because I think that's the only way we're going to collectively deal with it. The reality is we can't keep dealing with the same problems in the same way over and over again, because you know what? If we do, the result is going to be the same. So in this innovative, collaborative region, we need to really look outside of the box and see how do we collectively come up with a model that's going to respect everybody's integrity, the importance and the differences between each of the various art forms and aspects of arts and culture that we talk about, because that's integral to all this. One isn't better than the other. They're all part of the puzzle. But I think it's essential that we do this, because we do have an incredibly vibrant region, and we know that the people who are coming here and the people that are staying here continually identify the importance of it. I can't tell you the number of people that talk to me about the festivals this summer and just the vibrancy that was happening throughout our city, and saying, you know what, we need even more of this going forward. So in the one sense, well, yes, it may not be as important as sewer and water, which is a need, unequivocally. This is really important for how we develop as a society and how we develop as a people. And we can't lose sight of that as we go forward and deal with this issue comprehensively in the months ahead.
Okay. There are no more speakers. I've just been chatting with Councillor Galloway-Seelock with the wording for the amendment. And that would be, I think she's agreeable to this, that staff be directed to initiate the process to amend the appropriate bylaws to reduce council's representation on the Centre of the Square board to that of the mayor and one councillor. So it accomplishes what you were saying, but it sets the process. So we'll take the amendment first, and then presumably the amended motion afterwards. Recorded vote has been asked for. I'll just make a couple of comments. I'm not going to get into the detail of the report, because I think that, yes, there has been we have expended money on it, but it was necessary, I believe, to bring an independent, outside of the community look at the issues. And many of the findings were those that at least some of us knew already. But it is an independent report. And for the same reasons, I think an independent facilitator is required for further discussions between the two organizations, the Centre in the Square and the Symphony. And a number of other people were making comments about the long-term view, and Councillor Gazzola talked about this, and I think you really do have to look at this one in the long-term view as well, in where this will be in 5, 10, and 30 years from now. And you are at this council, not so much this council anymore, but certainly the next council will be in a position to set that stage, no pun intended, for how the Centre in the Square and its relationship with a lot of the other organizations in town, including the Symphony, will look like. And the final thing I wanted to comment about, and this is a point that Councillor Davey has raised a couple of times now, in terms of the lack of transparency in the not in the reporting, but in how the function of how we report the subsidy that the Centre in the Square provides to a number of other organizations in town. You can look at it many different ways, but and without any condescending tone, certainly on my part, to either the Symphony or the art gallery, if the two of the organizations were totally reliant on finding space and paying market rate, they would not be able to do so at the current subsidies that each of them receive from municipalities and other forms of government and donations. However, that is not necessarily a function, it's a function rather of the fact that the City of Kitchener is the only provider of funds to the Centre in the Square. So when you transfer those unstated costs that Councillor Davey was speaking about onto the Centre in the Square, that becomes an extra cost for the City of Kitchener. And so while we talk of the Centre in the Square, we have to understand that there are some other things that are included in that amount that otherwise might not be there if it was completely arm's length. That will take a long time to ferret out in our community because of our two-tier governance system. So with that, a recorded vote has been called for, and I will be supporting the recommendations as they stand now. On the amendment first, you may now vote. On the amendment. Those in favour? Opposed? That motion is carried. On the amended motion, you can now vote. Let me clarify that, because I don't want to put people into a position before you put that vote up. We're voting on the balance of the report as opposed to the amended motion. Okay? All right? Because it might put some people into a conflictual position here. Okay? So, I think people voted on that basis, and I saw nods, so we can go ahead. That is unanimous. So thank you very much to all of you, to Webb, who did the report, to our staff, a number of staff who are in the room today, and others who have been very much a part of this, and obviously to the Centre of the Square, to the KW Symphony, and from the Art Gallery, who is represented here today as well. Thank you very much. Now we have one other motion, and that is the authorizes to go into caucus. Just before we do, was there an additional item, I think, Mr. Chapman?
Through you, Mayor Zaire, staff emailed council last Friday to request an item subject to solicitor-client privilege be added, so that will be coming forward as well.
Okay, so those two items. Moved by Councillor Galloway-Seelock, second by Councillor Ioannidis. Those in favour? Opposed? That's carried. This meeting is adjourned.